Hello all, thanks so much for joining us again. So this is the second webinar in the Pollinator webinar series, and this is selecting plants for pollinators. And I'll start here with a few minutes of introductions, and then we will dive right into the presentation. So this webinar series has been created by Pollinator Partnership Canada, along with partners Habitat Acquisition Trust, myself with Saanich Native Plants, and Parks Canada. And I have an introduction a bit later on for myself, but I'll just say I'm with Saanich Native Plants. And I'd love to welcome our other partners and organizers for this series now. So they're going to turn on their microphone to introduce themselves. And we'll start there with Paige Erickson-McGee, who's with Habitat Acquisition Trust. If she can figure out how to put the microphone.
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to answer questions at the same time. But yes, my name's Paige, and I work for HAT, and I'm the stewardship coordinator there. And we work with members of the public who are interested in learning more about how to understand and care for wildlife and habitats on their own land and in their neighborhoods. And we have a pollinator stewardship program as well.
Thank you, Paige. And we'll go next with Amy Peltier, who's with Parks Canada.
Hello, bonjour. This is Amy Peltier. I work with Parks Canada as a species at risk engagement officer. And I've been working in Garry Oak ecosystem restoration and coastal sand ecosystem restoration for about 10 years, including working to restore pollinator, meadow habitat, and working to recover various different plant species at risk. So very excited to be here. I've really been enjoying the last couple of years in helping to teach the public more about pollinators and how we can be good stewards of them. So thanks for having me.
Thank you, Amy. And lastly, Laura Morandin, Dr. Laura Morandin with Pollinator Partnership Canada.
Thanks, Kristen. I'm the acting director for Pollinator Partnership Canada, and along with Pollinator Partnership, we're the largest organization in the world that's dedicated exclusively to the protection of pollinators and their habitat. We also manage the Island Pollinator Initiative program that a lot of you are probably familiar with. And I think Kristen will be doing a bit more of an introduction later, so I'll leave it at that.
Yes, I will. Today we're here to talk about plants and pollinator interactions, and these are intricate and ancient relationships, and protecting them is essential. And it's also important at all times to be aware that these creatures are part of stewarded First Nations territories and are considered relatives to the Coast Salish peoples of our area. And these nations include Lekwungen-speaking peoples of the Songhees and Lekwungen First Nations, Hulkaminam-speaking Shaanu First Nations, as well as Sauk First Nation, and the 5 nations of Saanich territory, including the Sinchothan-speaking Sayout, Sartlip, Paukachin, Sartlip, and Malahat First Nations. Opportunities for education about plants and animals is a real honor for all of us here today. And we hope that there is appreciation and stewardship garnered from nature through raising awareness. Special thanks to our webinar sponsors that have made it possible to provide this series free of charge for everybody. In addition, and especially to Pollinator Partnership Canada, there's Habitat Acquisitions Trust, Whole Foods, Van City, Parks Canada, and the Growing Together Initiative, who have helped provide funds to support this series. The series includes 10 webinars. Each has information online at the Island Pollinator Initiative website, which I'm sure many of you have been to, but be sure to visit that if you haven't. And we're sequentially conducting them over the summer and fall of this year. And every 1 to 2 weeks, you'll see one of these going on. And we're opening registration as soon as we're setting dates. So please be checking back to register. As you know, register is limited. But we do have recordings of the webinars available at the Island Pollinator Initiative website after each one is completed. So you can view them. And if you can't attend in person, please leave room for others to register, and you can just look at the recording later. And listed here are some of the upcoming ones. And so you can look at write-ups of all of these online at your convenience. We've designed the webinar series so that people can take them to become a certified pollinator steward. And we did that in person a few years back, but now because of COVID and other limitations, we're offering it as part of this series. So becoming a certified pollinator steward through Pollinator Partnership will demonstrate that you have a science-based understanding of pollinators and pollinator conservation, and that you're taking actions to help pollinators. So you can look back to the IPI webinar page for more information about that if that sounds of interest to you. And we did send an email out, but if you haven't received that, please go ahead and email Laura. So you'll see her email address at the bottom of the screen there. So moving into some logistics for today's webinar, the presentation portion will run until approximately 2. And then we'll have about 20 minutes for questions and answers with Laura and myself and other partners here. And you can submit your questions throughout the presentation using the question and answer function that you should see on your screen. And Amy from Parks Canada will be monitoring all the questions and answers and reporting back to us. And note that you can change how you view the webinar and the speaker layout through your webinar controls, and feel free to use the chat function there to speak with Paige and Amy if you're having any technical problems. So here's the moderator's favorite question choice award. So these are beautiful blank greeting cards developed through Pollinator Partnership and are part of a giveaway that Amy will decide on her favorite question that you participants bring to her, to us today. So be sure to provide some questions to things you'd like to learn more about, and you can receive a box of these beautiful cards. So I will go ahead and introduce the speakers for today, starting with myself. So I'm Kristen Miskelly, and I'm a biologist who specializes in the botany and ecology of southeastern Vancouver Island. And I'm very passionate about restoration, especially native plants and native plant propagation. And that sort of led me into co-founding a native plant nursery and consulting business named Saanich Native Plants. And we're dedicated to conserving and enhancing local ecosystems through making native plants and seeds available, and also educating where we can. Starting off today's webinar is Dr. Laura Morandin, and Laura is the Acting Director for Pollinator Partnership Canada, as well as the Research Director for Pollinator Partnership and Pollinator Partnership Canada. And she's been a bee and beneficial insect researcher for over 20 years with a master's and a PhD from Western University and Simon Fraser University, and also did her postdoctoral work at UC Berkeley. She has a whole bunch of peer-reviewed publications, has co-authored books, and has developed many technical and outreach guides on protecting pollinators. She works both on national and international pollinator conservation and policy issues. And she's been with Pollinator Partnership for about 5 years, and her ultimate goal is to create more sustainable landscapes that integrate conservation with human use. So you go take it away there, Laura.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kristen. I'm just going to get my share screen up here. Okay, thank you, and thank you all for being here. I'll start with a quick recap of what we covered in the first webinar in the series. As Kristen said, the recording can be found on the IPI website, and I'd recommend you check it out because it does set the stage for a lot of the topics we'll be discussing in this webinar and throughout the series. In the first webinar, we discussed the importance of pollination and who the pollinators are. Jenny Herron from the BC Ministry of Environment did a great talk on the status of pollinators in BC. I then covered native and managed bees, issues and misconceptions, and how to help, focusing on what habitat bees need. So we looked at the synergy of negative pressures that pollinators currently are facing, and we discussed that the best way to make a difference for pollinators and to preserve their populations is to create habitat for them. And by creating habitat, we also provide areas that are free of pesticides. So we interrupt two of these major pressures that are interacting to negatively impact native and native bees and managed honeybees and also other pollinators. And we highlighted that pollinators can really be a good news story in conservation, unlike some of the conservation problems we're facing where it's more difficult for individual actions to make a difference. We all have the ability to create habitat, and research shows that all sizes of habitat can help pollinators, from potted plants to home gardens to parks to roadsides, solar fields. It can really be a good news story in conservation if we all work together. And today we'll focus on selecting plants for pollinator habitat. So I'll primarily focus on selecting plants for native bees, but these plants also will support other native and managed pollinators. Okay, before we get into selecting plants, we'd like to see who you are in terms of what kind of land you manage and where you might be selecting plants for, what types of land. So I'm going to launch this poll, and you can all participate in it. You can select more than one option, I believe. So yeah, if you can tell us what type of land you'll be selecting plants for, and the options are a home garden or yard, a school garden, maybe a business or corporate building, municipal land, park land at any level of government. Maybe it's transportation or energy rights of way, or industrial land, or maybe there's something other that I didn't think to put there. And I'll just give you about 10 seconds here to answer.
Laura, can you hear me okay?
I can.
I just I saw a note there saying someone can't see the poll. Amy, when you're seeing the comments coming up there, are you seeing that from a variety of participants?
We've had about 86% that's voted. So I think most people can see. 90%, 93%, maybe they've worked it out.
Yeah, people just noted they can only vote for one answer.
Oh, sorry about that. I wanted you to have more than one. I'll work on setting that differently next time. Okay, great. So we have about 93% of people that voted, and I'm going to share the responses here with everybody. So hopefully you can see that. So the vast majority of people here, about 78%, are interested in selecting plants for their home garden or yard. Some people are also interested in businesses and corporate buildings. One person for municipal land, a few people for parkland, and then a few people for other types of land. So thank you for sharing that with us. Okay, so as I mentioned, I'll be focusing on selecting plants that support native bees in most ecosystems. Bees are the most important pollinators. They're incredibly diverse as well, with about 4,000 species in North America, about 450 in British Columbia, and a few hundred on Vancouver Island, a couple hundred anyways. In the next webinar series, James Miskelly will be discussing butterflies and how to support them. Okay, so let's get into how to select plants to support pollinators. We have a summary brochure on selecting plants for pollinators at pollinator-partnership.ca. It's free for download, like all our resources. And my section of this presentation will be sort of general information, discussing selecting plants, and then Kristen is going to get into more of the local details. This slide is an overview of how we can look at plant types when wanting to support pollinator populations. So starting at the top, these are the ones we really want to prioritize when we're selecting plants. To support the most robust, diverse, and abundant populations of native pollinators, we should prioritize the use of native plants and local native genetics if possible. Non-native plants can also provide great support for pollinators. Some cover crops, type plants, herbs, garden vegetable flowers, and ornamentals that are closely resemble how they originally looked in the wild can all be good for pollinators. So I call these ones the forage non-natives because they provide great forage, pollen and nectar for generalist native bees and managed bees. Going down the list, we get types of plants that are less valuable for pollinators. Highly bred ornamental plants are bred for looks generally and often provide little or no resources for pollinators. And down the list at the bottom there, those are the ones we really need to avoid, the non-natives that are invasive and are noxious weeds. So let's go into some more depth on some of those plant types. First, why do we put native plants at the top of the list for what to choose when supporting pollinators? So we need to go back in time a little bit and look at how flowering plants and pollinators, particularly native bees, evolved with the plants in their region. Around 140 million years ago, during the dinosaur age, angiosperms, the flowering plants, evolved and then started to diversify. And many new forms and species developed over a relatively short time. And now, the flowering plants make up almost 90% of the plants on our planet. Around the same time, the bees were diversifying at an explosive rate, evolutionarily speaking, and that diversification of both groups, the flowering plants and the bees, is believed to have happened in partnership in a process called coevolution. So what this means for us in supporting pollinators is that the rich diversity of bees that are native to an area are dependent on the rich diversity of native plants also there, and vice versa. Importantly, some native bees are narrow or broad specialists, meaning that they rely on native plant species or groups of native plant species that they co-evolved with. Other native bees are more generalists and can use a wide variety of plants, whether they've evolved specifically with those plants or not. And there's some research on preference of native bees for native plants and how native plants can support a more diverse bee community. I did a number of studies in California's Central Valley assessing native bees and other pollinators in native plant hedgerows compared to scrubby field edges, which is what most of these fields have. These scrubby edges do have some highly attractive weedy plants for pollinators, the mustards and some bindweeds and asters and clovers, but they don't have native plants. Excuse me. We found a few really interesting things. First, native bees were preferentially seeking out the native plant species that were planted in these hedgerows. And really interesting, in all our types of collections, all 50 or so species of bees we found were using the native plants or in those native plant areas. Whereas in these weedy scrubby edges that had pollinator attractive non-native plants, we found less than half of the native bee species on those plants. So while the non-native plants were attractive to some bees, almost half the native bee species were not found on them or in those sites at all. And if we're trying to create regions that support the amazing and beautiful diversity of bees and other pollinators that are meant to be in our region, we really need to focus on native plants. There's a lot of other reasons to select native plants that Kristen will get into, but I'll just focus on the pollinator support reasons in my section. But we don't have to use native plants exclusively or all the time to support pollinators. In some habitats, non-native, non-invasive plants may be more convenient or economical, available, or familiar. So for example, in agricultural fields, some cover crops, if left to flower, can be great support for generalist pollinators. And they support managed pollinators as well. And in urban areas, we often like planting herbs and vegetables and ornamental plants, and this can all be good support for pollinators. So we developed this guide, planting guide to support honeybees and native bees a few years back for Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. The guide has plants that support pollinators by regions of Canada. And we focused on native plants based on large regions, but we also included lots of agricultural type honeybee forage plants that are not native, but also not invasive. And this too is available for download on our website. So ornamental plants are highly variable in their attractiveness and value to pollinators. And there's been a few recent studies on this. One study that came out this year from Penn State that Pollinator Partnership was involved in compared ornamental plants to native plants and found that while the ornamental plants can provide resources to a large abundance of pollinators, it's mainly the generalist pollinators that the ornamentals support, not the full diversity of native pollinators. And they recommended using native plants if you can, or look for ornamentals that resemble their wild types in shape and color. And that's because flowers that are, let's say, doubled to produce extra petals, they might look great to people, but they can be difficult for pollinators to handle or may have less pollen and nectar. They also recommend asking your local pollinators, and I love this. So take the time to observe who is visiting your various ornamental and native plants. We have a webinar later in the series on identifying and monitoring pollinators if you'd like to learn more about that. Excuse me. So this takes us into the issue of invasive plants. Unfortunately, we have a lot of invasive plants in our region, and many are still being sold in garden centers and are even present in some pollinator seed mixes. The main problem with invasive plants in relation to pollinators is that they outcompete the native plants, often blanketing areas that should be a diverse mix of native plants. This is a picture I took at Sax Point Park near my house, which is overrun with English ivy. And sadly, there are a few native forage species. So we suggest that you remove invasive plants when you can. Definitely don't purchase them to plant, and check pollinator seed mixes and other seed mixes for invasive plants. A great resource for BC for checking if a plant is invasive is the Invasive Species Council of BC. They have lists of invasive plants along with plant pictures. They also have a great guide on which natives you can grow instead of some of these invasive plants that I've shown here. And just a quick preview of some of our beautiful native plants that support a diverse array of native pollinators. And Kristen will be getting into more detail into some of these. In terms of diversity of plant species that you use, I'll just touch on this today. Most research shows a strong relationship between plant diversity and pollinator diversity. So it is beneficial to try and use a diversity of plants when creating habitat. Kristen's going to talk about some diversity of form and season that's important to consider as well. One thing I haven't mentioned yet is that when we do support a diversity of pollinators, we create more robust networks and resilience in systems. And these robust systems with a diversity of plants and pollinators may better be able to withstand fluctuating and extreme climate events and other pressures. Okay, now into some specifics for Southern Vancouver Island. Dr. Elizabeth Ellie and a number of her grad students have assessed native bee use of plants on Southern Vancouver Island and throughout the coast. They've examined bees on non-native pollinator attractive garden plants as well as native plants in habitat fragments. So these data give us some insight into what plants are best to support an abundance and diversity of bees in our region. This graph shows bee group visits on non-native pollinator attractive garden plants. And this graph shows bee groups visiting native plants. The graphs can be found on Elizabeth Ellie's SFU, Simon Fraser University website, and we have a link to her page on the IPI website resource tab. Kristen will be going into more detail on which plants attract which bee groups. To select specific plants for pollinators, Pollinator Partnership Canada has eco-regional planting guides for many regions of Canada and also pretty much the entire US. There's a lot of information in these guides on bees and other pollinators, how to support them, specific characteristics of the ecoregion, and the unique pollinator communities in each ecoregion. Each guide has a list of about 100 plus native plants for that region that support pollinators, including bloom season, habitat requirements, and what pollinators they support. So these are free for download on our site. And this is the guide for Eastern Vancouver Island ecoregion, which includes the CRD. And we also have a one-pager pocket guide for this region for selecting plants for pollinators. Again, you can find those on the IPI site. The plant list in this guide was developed in consultation with Kristen and James Muskelly. And each eco-regional guide we do, we always consult local experts when we're creating the plant lists. So I'll end my section here on a really exciting new tool that's being developed by a group at SFU, led by Dr. Melissa Guzman in the McGonigal Lab and with Elizabeth Ellie, and in consultation with Pollinator Partnership Canada. So they're developing a web-based app to take data on pollinator species and plant associations and make it usable to the public. So for example, the app will allow you to search exactly what plants support what pollinators in your region. And the current regions that are being developed right now are in the upper corner there on that map. And it can be used to create lists of the top 10 plants, for example, that will support the most pollinator diversity. The group will be publishing the app and the code for this app by late summer. After it's published even, it'll grow and be modified as more data for our region and other regions are added. So keep an eye out for that. I'll send out info on the various IPI platforms when it's available. Okay, so let's revisit this slide for a moment before I end. We want to prioritize the use of local native and native plants. Non-natives won't support the same diversity as native plants, but some, the herbs and bee forage plants and not very modified ornamentals, can support the generalist pollinators in high numbers. Ornamentals that are highly modified likely provide little to no valued pollinators, and always avoid invasive and noxious weeds. Make sure you don't purchase them and remove them when you can. And to take you into Kristen's section, remember we have about 4,000 species of native bees in North America and about 450 species in BC. And they're critical to our ecosystems and food production. You don't have to do everything at once as well. Start small, add in some native plants, and observe what pollinators you see on those plants. Consult with experts and find guides or other online tools for your area to help you select plants that will best support the amazing diversity of pollinators in your area. Okay, thank you. Over to you, Kristen.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was really fantastic. The talk that I'd like to get into is about what we can plant to promote pollinators and also kind of features in our planting spaces that tend to attract pollinators as well. And this particular talk is fairly focused on home gardens, but I recognize that we have people who are park managers based on that poll. And I also saw a chat there going on that we also have a bunch of farmers here, or people working on larger parcels on their properties. And so you will find lots of applicable information here, and then also be sure to check back on the future webinars where we will talk about larger spaces as well. It's always so important to remember that the most effective and impactful conservation tools are through the conservation and protection of native habitats, as well as restoring and managing them. And so I like to use sort of the phrase conserve, enhance, and protect as a reminder of that. And that's not to say our actions on smaller parcels or home gardens aren't meaningful. They certainly are, but it is always important to remember that that the protection is also needed as part of that puzzle piece, or as part of that puzzle. Whether it be balconies or planters, up to large covenant areas on private land, those parcels too are really important, and what you do with them really does matter. So Southern Vancouver Island is part of a unique ecoregion. So I put that map there, and our ecoregion is called the Willamette Valley Puget Trough Georgia Basin ecoregion. And one of the ecosystem types here, which you'll probably be familiar with, are called Garry Oak ecosystems. And those ecosystems are incredibly important for pollinators. They boast a diversity of wildflowers that have co-evolved with native bees and other pollinating insects found here. And unfortunately, these are imperiled ecosystems, not only in British Columbia, but throughout the ecoregion to Oregon and Washington as well. And they do include an abundance of species at risk. And some of the main driving factors for declines include habitat degradation, and that's through both development and invasive species. Garry Oak ecosystems are what you can think of as an ecocultural landscape, and there is a rich and complex history that certainly the talk today isn't going to do justice to, but I would like to comment on that Indigenous land management practices like fire have enabled these ecosystems and their pollinators to thrive. And there's also these abiotic factors like precipitation and temperature that play into that. And interestingly, our area, the Victoria area, for example, has the lowest average summer precipitation in all of Canada. And that's part of what drives this unique flora that we see here. So conserving native and local biodiversity is the single most important and only way of really conserving global biodiversity. And native plants really are the foundation to the web of life that is unique to our area. And thinking about really what makes a place when you're really thinking about that, it has a lot to do with the nature of that place. And that the creatures and native plants of an area, I think importantly, have intrinsic value and worth, and to remember that just their existence is worth their conservation. They're also, as I mentioned, building blocks for biological diversity, and that's across taxa. So that's across a whole variety of groups of life. Also fostering for non-Indigenous people that are part of this presentation today, thinking about what we talked about, those relationships with plants and place and wildlife, that fostering a respect for Indigenous peoples' culture and food systems, and thinking about how important those are to people's culture, and having respect for stewardship and the management that has occurred here for those thousands of years and is ongoing. When you use native plants and create these habitat patches, you're increasing the effective size of surrounding habitat. So you're sort of extending the benefits of parklands and other natural areas that may be adjacent to you. And there's also these wonderful benefits that we each have, those kind of unspeakable joys of learning about nature and sharing that with our family, but also thinking about the future generations to come and leaving sort of a legacy of nature behind us as well. And then there are some very pragmatic benefits to using native plants that can include reduced water of usage when you're planting certain plant species, perhaps using fewer fertilizers or pesticides, and then all the things that go with that, like not mowing as much and things like that. So we're gonna take a quick fun break here for a sec and just do another poll. So we were curious to find if people have found limitations with sourcing native plants, or if people are being able to source plants freely now. So we'd just like you to answer the question here. Do you know where to source native plants for your project? So the first point reads, yes, I know where I can get enough. Or I know where I can find some, but not enough. Or thirdly, not sure how to source or find native plants for my project. So we'll just give you a minute there, and then we'll see the responses pop up. Laura, I can't see who's responded, so maybe if you could just pipe in there, or turn your camera on, give me a thumbs up when you think it's ready to go, or I suppose the answers will pop up.
Yeah, we've got 89% that have voted now, so I'll just give it another second, and then I'll end the poll and share it. Okay, I'll end the polling, and now I'll share the results.
So we have about half of folks who say, yes, I know where I can get enough. So that's great to hear, but we'd love to see the other 50% also feel confident about where to source. And about 40% of you said, I know where I can find some, but not enough. And another 10% were not sure how to source or find native plants for projects. And later we're going to talk about some ways and opportunities to source native plants that we hope will help sort of get rid of some of those barriers to people who might want to do restoration, are limited by maybe finding them, but also the expenses associated with buying plants. So there are some key attributes of pollinator-friendly gardens that I'd love to chat with you about. Most importantly, if you have natural spaces, again, I'll just reiterate, be sure to conserve and enhance them. And you see through Dr. Mirandon's research that having these adjacent parcels of natural habitat are incredibly beneficial. And then if you're planting native plants on degraded habitats, that can include home gardens, it makes a big difference. And you can always feel free to reach out to everyone associated with the webinar today if you ever need help. So some of the attributes of pollinator-friendly gardens, and these are just some themes, but for example, use at least some native plants. So that doesn't mean you need to rip out everything and only use native plants, but even if you have a fairly ornamental or conventional garden, putting in a few highly desirable native plants into those areas can have huge benefits. And you also want to be able to produce resources, so pollen and nectar throughout the growing season for the wave of pollinators that comes out sequentially over the season. So everything from those early season bees like mason bees right into the late summer. And I'll show you kind of a timeline of a few species that you can think about doing that, but you should be able, through planting a diversity of plants, provide resources from very, very early spring into fall. Providing nesting habitat within your garden spaces, so that can include wood cavities, bare soil for those species that nest in the ground, and also hollow stems can even provide habitat. So it just reminds us about not cleaning up our gardens too much. And then avoiding pesticide-treated plants is important, especially neonicotinoids. And there again, I've said maintain existing natural areas, so I guess I don't need to say that again. So diversity often leads to more diversity, and that's a general trend throughout the world. And so when you're planting, please think about the sizes and shapes of the different flowers that you're planting. And you can just do that visually, where you'll find certain species of bees will have preferences for different kind of flowers, and that's related to the size of the bee and their tongue length. So a plant like shooting star in the top left there has specialized mechanisms for releasing pollen through the buzz of bumblebees. And the camas in the upper right is open with the exposed anthers and pollen, making the access of the flower really easy. And in the bottom right, that's a helenium flower where that beautiful bumblebee can hop that head of the flower is actually a composite of hundreds of individual mini flowers that the bees can harvest kind of economically. And then to the left, you're looking at a large leaf lupin, and that looks like a Bombus vase nasenskyii, that it has that huge pollen pack on its legs. And those larger size bees can make it into the flower of the lupin, because they actually have to crawl in there. And then you can imagine that the small little bees are going to want smaller flowers and so on. Structural diversity is also really important to consider. So structural diversity can include leaving bare soil areas for ground nesting bees. So that central picture is illustrating that point. So that's long stolen sedge, where it sort of gently creeps below ground and pops up, but it will often leave some bare soil areas. And remembering not to over tidy your spaces, because things like hollow stems, so in the bottom right there, you're seeing Barestem desert parsley in the winter, but you can have bees that have used the hollow stems there, and so it's important to just leave them standing. And later, further in the webinar series, we'll also talk about hedgerows, and I'll kind of leave that up to Paige when she gets to that presentation, but that's also included in structural diversity. And not over tidying doesn't mean that everything has to be a mess in order to promote pollinators, but it does mean to be aware that if you over tidy, you can also at times be removing habitat. So it's important to prioritize what you really want from your garden, what you like to provide, and kind of strike a balance there. And that includes being forgiving of nature. So to conserve pollinators, we need to make room for them. And that sometimes means setting realistic expectations. So there's a dichotomy there with, you know, folks wanting leaves that have no damage to them and things like that. But really seeing some damage on leaves can be a promising sign that your garden is doing the job that you want it to do. So this beautiful picture, our friend Tamara posted this today. This is leafcutter bee evidence on fireweed, and it's a super pollinator friendly plant just for the flowers, but here's another way that plant is useful, and it also has hollow stems, and we'll look at flowers of it later, I mean. And we need to also take a broad approach to how we relate to nature, and that certainly, you know, and our relation to nature can include what you might think of as plant uses, but we should be really careful about having entirely human-centric approaches to how we relate to nature. So here's a patch of Himalayan blackberry that we ended up, you know, shifting into a more diverse assemblage of plants. But yes, a plant like this does have tasty berries, and is certainly, you know, people love to collect the berries and eat them. And we do see bees certainly using the flowers, but in the end, even species like this that do have some benefits really do come at the expense of native plant diversity. And subsequently, that means at the expense of pollinators and other wildlife. And even though some bees will happily use a patch of Himalayan blackberry, they do tend to be generalist species, and the resources only last for a short time. And meanwhile, they're kind of forming these monocultures and out competing other diversity. So here's a picture of that same patch. So we just worked with a group of students, removed the blackberry, planted a whole suite of friendly shrubs and trees, and we put, you know, patches of goldenrod and fireweed and other things. And this is a much better alternative to sort of plant a diverse suite of species that then offer ongoing nutrition through the season and other resources. And that will include not only those generalist species, but a broader range of insects over a longer period of time. And just to summarize there, it really is important that we approach things with a thoughtful and holistic approach towards conservation. And just keep in mind that when you see bees using non-native invasive species, not to confuse that as a substitute to a diverse suite of native flora. Here's that slide I alluded to earlier in terms of a timeline of planting. And we'll touch on these species later, but I thought I'd throw this up just to emphasize that native plants planted strategically can certainly provide a succession of blooms. And that in turn, you know, it's the resources that pollinators need. And as those different pollinators come out over the season, including thinking about, you know, including something that's going to be blooming in February, like June plum. Right now is the season of farewell to spring. And then soon we're gonna, well, actually the goldenrods have started, and then we'll start to get into Douglas aster and entire leaf gumweed. And one of the latest flowering and also drought tolerant plants is a plant called yampa. And both those, like yampa and gumweed, you can see into October, November, and sometimes you'll see these crazy patches of gumweed at the shoreline, like even around the harbor or something like that, that are in bloom right through the winter. And it seems like they really never stop blooming. So before I move into planting suggestions, we have a really fun game. So I'm not sure if everyone can see me or not, but I just wanted to hold up the jar so you had the context. Laura, can everyone see that there? It's hard for me to tell, but
That looks good, Kristen.
okay. So what I'd like you to do here is to type these are grape camas seeds in the mason jar, and I want you to type how many seeds you think are in that small mason jar. And Amy with Parks Canada, who's the moderator today, is going to choose the person who got the closest to the true number of seeds. And then the seed packets that you see there, you're going to receive 4 seed packets that you can either come by Saanich Native Plants for, or I will mail them to you. So I'll give you a few seconds there, and then I guess I think we're up to about 45 or so folks that have answered. So I'll just wait till I see the number get higher there.
Or we could let people keep putting in their responses and do it right at the end if you'd like, Kristen, whatever you like.
Yeah, that's smart thinking, Laura. So the plants that we're going to look at today are mostly herbaceous plants, because we have the other workshops that are focusing on, you know, hedgerows for shrubs and trees. And then we're also going to be doing a creating meadows for pollinators workshop. And so those land managers that are here looking to enhance larger spaces, but also homeowners who want to do like lawn to meadow conversions, be sure to check back. And I recognize we're already at 1:50, so I'm going to try to pick up the pace here. And I hope if we do run a bit over, you can stick around with us, and we'll certainly stick around with you. So I sort of put these in a successional order. So what you're seeing, every slide you see is going to be ones that come into bloom after the next. So I started it off with blue-eyed Mary, and these are a small annual plant, and they are small, but they pack a big punch. And you do see a lot of early season bees, like mason bees, and also bumblebees and things like that at them, and they are really beautiful. And then blooming along with small flowered blue-eyed Mary, you'll see one of maybe our most famous local plants, sea blush, and it's just a real stunning species with these beautiful, you know, pink flowers in these spherical clusters, and they're They tend to be fairly deer resistant, and just the bounty of pollinators at them is truly remarkable. And like the blue-eyed Marys, these are annual species as well. And that's different from annual species that you might be thinking of in your garden. So these are plants that will reseed themselves year to year as long as they have a little bare soil to do it. So it's not that you're planting them every single year or anything like that. And you can get really tremendous big patches of them. And just a photo to show those two blooming together, just to make you guys all want a patch of these. And even from seed, you can sow these in the fall from seed and have big patches that are in full bloom that very first spring season. So spring gold is part of the carrot plant family, which you can probably tell just by the shape of the flower there, the umbel shape. And so we're going to look at two native carrot related plants. So this is Lomatium utriculatum, and they bloom early. And when I was talking about kind of smaller flowers attracting smaller bees, you'll see that with these, and the diversity of bees is truly remarkable at them. And you can see why they call them spring gold, because they have in the spring, when you just see, you know, a carpet of these in between all the lush green growth of the spring, they really are striking. Common camas. So this is one of the two species of camas that are indigenous to the Victoria area. And the abundance of pollinators at these is just just unreal. And later we'll also look at a photo of great camas, but you'll notice there's sort of an asymmetry in the petals, and that's one of the ways to tell them apart from great camas. And they also tend to be shorter, they tend to be lighter blue in color, and there's other characteristics that are more subtle that I won't bother mentioning here, but a really wonderful thing to include if you're thinking about planting native plants and trying to encourage pollinators. This and the other camas species are really essential. So here's great camas, and you'll see that beautiful bee kind of hovering towards the camas. And these the great camas get very tall and have very large bulbs and have tremendous value here, both ecologically and culturally. So here's that other carrot relative I mentioned, Barestem desert-parsley. You'll also hear Lomatium nudicaule or KEXMIN. There's Cinchothan words and Holcomenum words for this species, and it is, again, another species that is really important ecologically and culturally. And you'll recognize that picture of the hollow stems. It provides a resource like that. Beautiful seeds, and then also you see a suite of small native bees using the flowers. And they look stunning just from, you can imagine those long stalks being a beautiful thing in the winter, even aesthetically, and then the flowers and the seeds, just a very beautiful plant. And they get quite tall, so those features are exaggerated. There are two native honeysuckles, so I've just put a picture of one here, Linicera ciliosa, or orange honeysuckle. Sometimes you see Western trumpet honeysuckle is the name, and then also red columbine. And I'm gonna just quickly drag this photo over. I see it got blocked, but I wanted to share sort of the nectar robbing with you. So they're bypassing the anthers where they would have pollinated the plant and transferred it to a new plant, and they're going straight to the source. So they're sort of like robber bees. And these two species, I wanted to include these because they're one way to attract pollinators to shady parts of your garden. And they don't exclusively need shade, but they both do well in shade. So if you're looking to get a few of the larger bees that can fly in shade, those are great choices. So large-leafed lupin, we have a bunch of native lupin species on southern Vancouver Island. Most of them are annual, but here's one of the showiest ones. And this is a native variety of large leaf lupins. And unfortunately, a lot of the ones you see along the highway, they're what you call Russell hybrids. And they're related to Lupinus polyphilus, but they're not the native species. So it's nice to try to, if you are wanting to plant lupins, try to stick with the native species because they do hybridize regularly. So you want to be careful about sort of, I guess for lack of a better word, but contaminating the genetics of local native species. So Roemer's fescue is one of our native bunch grasses. And sometimes plants that don't have what you think of as typical flowers get overlooked, but they are like absolutely essential for habitat health as well as pollinators. And so grasses and sedges and rushes are flowering plants, and they do have flowers. They're just highly modified, but equally as beautiful. And especially when you start to kind of learn about their beauty, they can become even more attractive to you. And that Roemer's fescue, if you look in the bottom right, that beautiful green moving into yellow and then kind of this purplish color when they go to flower in the summer. And they have habitat features. James will, in the butterfly talk, go into butterflies that require native grasses, but for bees, they're important too. When they form a bunch, they create bare soil areas below them, and those can then become the nesting sites for some of the ground nesting native bees. And this is another example. So these are a native grass, but I wanted to highlight June grass as one of the most aesthetic, beautiful bunch grasses we have. Just those shining flowers, and they stay in those distinctive bunches. And if you're looking for something that maybe has a more ornamental look but is an indigenous grass, that would be a great pick for you as well. So woolly sunflower has just wrapped up blooming, but if you are looking for a deer resistant, showy, easy to grow, just phenomenal for pollinators and long blooming, this is the plant for you. It is just just spectacular. And you'll see cuckoo bees, sweat bees, bumblebees, and everything in between. And when I say blooms for a long time, I really mean it. Like, we grow patches like this without any water at all, and you certainly can too. But if you do have a space where you even have, it gets watered once or twice in the summer, you'll see an even longer bloom time for it. But with this wet spring, we had these going for at least a couple months without any water. And here's a beautiful composition of Roemer's fescue with woolly sunflower, and the two growing together is beautiful. And you can really see the purple of the fescue color there. So nodding onion is one of several native onion species. It has large nodding heads that bees go to. And you don't want to take too many of the plants away, but the whole plant is edible if that's something that appeals to you. And maybe if you got a large patch going, you could put some flowers in your salad, or harvest bulbs or harvest leaves, that kind of thing, while always remembering to leave some for the bees that are using them. And there's a picture of nodding onion with woolly sunflower behind it. So when you're designing gardens or thinking about resource patches in natural area plantings or things like that, planting species that bloom together next to each other can be really striking. Here's fool's onion. So it's not a true onion, it's not an allium species, it's Tritolea hyacinthina. But look at the venation and the petals, that purple venation, and these long, beautiful stalks, and the leaves actually die back when it flowers, and you can get these really beautiful patches of fool's onion there that the bees go to. So if you have a wetter spot, these are blooming right now, and they'll wrap up in the next week or so, but their name is Henderson's checker mallow, Sedelsia hendersonii. And I've planted them in everything from a planter to just a garden space, and they bloom freely and love this space. But if you get a moisture spot or even flooded in the winter, and then it kind of dries to a baking clay, these are a great match for you. And just in terms of stunning beauty, it's hard to beat Sedelcias. And just a couple pictures of them, you'll see they're blooming along with the fool's onion that you saw behind them in big patches. And another picture to show you, you're looking at fool's onion and Barestem desert parsley and Roemer's fescue and others that we talked about today. So I've been getting a lot of emails about this one because it's in bloom right now, and so people are wanting to identify it. So there are 2 species locally. One is a non-native subspecies that the leaf morphology looks different than this one, but this subspecies lanceolata is a native species and wonderful for bees, and you'll hear from James that it's also an important butterfly plant. And this is a great one actually to mention because it's one that it has such a realm of habitats that it likes. Like you can put it in sun right to full shade and anything from dry to wet. So it's extremely easygoing. You kind of can't go wrong with it, and it's gorgeous. And it blooms with Henderson's checker mallow. Yarrow will be one that's familiar to many of you, and there are just like a crazy amount of ornamental yarrows that come in a range of colors. And it's sort of the same as lupins or columbines where they hybridize really readily. So if you plant our pure native variety with or species with another variety of yarrow, unfortunately they tend to convert into the non-native one. So I encourage you to try to source the white native Achillea millefolium because it's beautiful, the pollinators like it, and to try to stick with that one. And it's completely deer resistant. It has beautiful, soft fern-like foliage, tall, blooms late, and blooms for a long time, and even provides seeds for birds through the winter. And you'll recognize this. So we looked at that picture of the leaf cutter bees. So here's fireweed, striking, tall, just a wonderful plant and has tons of character and a real structural kind of plant in terms of aesthetics. This is another plant. So we're in the summer, deep summer here, or midsummer, I guess, but farewell to spring. So this is an example of a later blooming annual. How can you go wrong with this? It looks great. And I guess this picture of Canada goldenrod kind of sums up what I'm trying to say. And if I was to pick one plant, maybe, that if you were to put one thing for pollinators in your garden, this might be it in terms of abundance and diversity for insects in general, and has these beautiful golden pyramidal shaped flowers. And I won't go into it fully, but if you're concerned about allergies, that's just a myth. There are wind pollinated plants that are around when this is blooming. So people have sort of made the false inference that it's solidago, but solidago is not wind pollinated, doesn't cause allergies. And there's tons and tons of studies showing that. So if you're in that group that thinks your allergies are from goldenrod, just look at that again and don't be afraid of planting goldenrod. And also don't be afraid of planting mountain sneezeweed. Unfortunately, native plants sometimes get horrid common names. So this is a relic name from people crushing and snuffing the seeds. I don't know really what that does to you, but I don't personally advise it. And a wonderful, just like, look at that plant. It has it looks basically like a yellow echinacea, and you can plant it as something in like a garden space. But if you have something that is really wet in the winter and then dries to kind of super baking clay, it does well as well. And there is a video, but I'm not going to try it because I think it won't work for everybody. And blooming along with the Helenium, Douglas's aster. There's a woodland skipper on it, so James can speak better to that in the butterfly presentation. But if you want to plant something with Helenium or goldenrod, this will overlap with bloom time and give you give pollinators fall resources. And here's a suite of those sort of fall resource plants blooming together with the Douglas aster and Helenium in the back, and some hardhack as well. And we're almost done here. I know I'm a bit over time and I apologize for that. I have a few more slides and I'll really try to speed it up. I apologize. So entire leafed gumweed, Grindelia stricta, carpenter bees, sweat peas, leafcutter bees, and a whole bunch of other bees, bright colors, blooms forever. If you want blooms that are like in October, this is just a great plant. So we are certainly lucky to live in a place where conservation is part of many people's way of life. And I don't know about you, but sometimes I get overwhelmed with how many opportunities there actually are to learn, because I always feel like I should be doing something else or doing something because there's so much going on. And so, you know, I wanted to make sure to pull out some resources for our area that I think are some really great resources. So the Pacific Northwest Plant Knowledge Cards are terrific, and Saanich Ethnobotany is wonderful. Of course, resources coming out of Habitat Acquisition Trust and Pollinator Partnership. And then I won't read all those out for sake of time, but you're gonna see sort of these different groups and opportunities that are listed there that I think are just tremendous, and wonderful people working with them as well. Cascadia Prairie Oak Partnership, I would highly recommend. A terrific listserv in particular, and also a technical resource library about restoration. And BC is, like James and myself are part of the steering committee for CPOP, and Cascadia Prairie Oak Partnership is a group that is part of the BC extent of Garry Oak ecosystem. So please be sure to check that out. eFlora for plant IDs, as well as iNaturalist for plant IDs, and lots of information about Garry Oak ecosystems through the Garry Oak Ecosystems Recovery Team webpage as well. And I'm gonna toot my own horn a little bit here, as well as the horns of our staff and volunteers and partners and collaborators. But if sourcing native plants and seeds has been an issue for you, please know there are opportunities there. So our nursery is trying to provide one opportunity for you, and we provide native plants specific to Southern Vancouver Island. So when you're walking around our nursery, there isn't one thing there that isn't native to sort of the Victoria, Metchosin, Saanich area. Like, that is the only thing we do. And that includes even the genetics of the plants. And there's more information about what I mean by that on our website. And we're open Tuesdays to Saturdays, 9 to 4. We have plants, we have seeds. If you're looking for seeds, especially bulk native seeds, you need to send us an email in advance so we can package them up. But please do come by, and please check out our website to learn more as well. And there are other nurseries that offer exclusively native plants as well in our area. And that includes Streamside Native Plants, Nanaimo Areas Land Trust, and NATS is on the mainland, but has a broad diversity of native plants. They do have some wholesale restrictions, but if you're working on a really big project, that might be well suited to you. So be sure to check them out. I'll give, let me think here. So Fraser Thimble Farms offers a huge array of native plants. They're on Salt Spring, but they also supply the Swan Lake Native Plant Sale. And for many of us, you know, that Swan Lake Native Plant Sale and those plants coming out of Fraser Thimble Farms served as the parts of the education in our region about native plants. And I just can't say enough about them. And just Richard Fraser and his wife who run the nursery and everything, I just give them a huge round of applause for the work that they've done there. And for seeds, I'm not entirely sure what everybody has available right now, but I know at times there, like Yellow Point Propagation would be a good place to check out. Machosen Farm, Raven Song Seed, and also Pick Seed. And again, Saanich Native Plants has seeds as well. And I will say that here's a list of nurseries you can check out, but I always encourage you at anytime you're purchasing native plants and seeds, please use the knowledge that you have to ask meaningful questions to the nursery owners or wherever you're buying them from. And some of those things you might ask are, you know, are the plants native to your specific area? So things can be labeled native or wildflowers or whatever and not be native at all. So you have to kind of take that on yourself or find someone who might know and reach out to them about that, and not just take it for granted that if something's labeled native that it is, because it really isn't necessarily. And you can also ask about methods of propagation. So have they been grown without neonicotinoids, pesticides, herbicides, that kind of stuff, and just empower yourself by learning about the right kinds of questions to ask and doing your own research as well. So thank you so much. And we're gonna stop there for question period, and Amy will.
All right, hi guys. Things just froze for me for a second there. I'm still here. I've been keeping track of everybody's questions. There's been lots of great questions. I think maybe before we do the questions, just so that people who are on here have a chance to find out who won the great Camas seed count, I'll call out the winner to that. So there was a whole range of answers, ranging from like 200 seeds up to a guess of 12,000 seeds. And the answer is actually 9,270 seeds. So there's a lot more in there than you think. And the winner of that was, let's see, Gladys. No, wait, I just got to wait. Check here, Gladys Ogilvie.
Woo!
Congratulations, Gladys Ogilvie. And I know how to contact you, so we can connect with you to connect with Kristen to get you those seeds. Okay, so on to the questions part. And I think in fairness, I'm going to start with some of the earliest questions first. I'm not sure that we're going to get through all of them, but I have recorded them all in a document, so the panelists can see them and maybe be able to get back to people or to post some sort of general answers to them. So this person, Scott, said, I belong to an orchard cooperative and our group wants to put a beehive in the orchard. I am wondering if putting a beehive would cause hardship and possible extermination of the native bees on the land.
So I think Laura is just turning on her mic there because she knows a lot about honeybee and native bee interactions.
Yeah, thanks, Kristen. You know, I think the thing is, there is not a lot known by anybody about honeybee and native bee interactions. The way that we think about it often is if you're in, you know, a highly modified area, and especially a place like agriculture, we often need honeybees to pollinate those mass blooming crops. So, you know, there isn't a big problem with that. There could be some competition on that land if there are limiting floral resources during certain times of the year, during all the year. So I encourage beekeepers, and beekeepers are usually great with this, plant more resources for all pollinators, and you really can't go wrong with that. But in terms of the honeybees exterminating the native bees, I wouldn't go that far. I don't think that would happen. And we do need honeybees in our agricultural systems.
Great, thank you. Okay. Let's see here. So Cameron asked, Cameron, for bees that dig homes in the ground, do they need large patches of bare soil, or will they use the space under shrubs and plants?
Okay, maybe I'll take this one again, but chime in, Paige and Kristen, if you'd like to too. They can use, it's different for different species for sure. So some of our digger bees seem to like to nest communally, so it's sometimes large patches of bare ground that they are more going for, from what I've seen. But they really can use tiny, tiny spaces of soil. So even grass that's not sort of like a golf course type lawn. So if you've got grass, just normal lawn grass even, they can nest between the blades of grass there. So don't try to get those really carpet type lawns, and you'll probably see some bees coming out of your lawn. But definitely under those structural plants that Kristen was mentioning, bees will nest in there as well. And try to keep your mulch down as well. I know mulch is awesome for keeping weeds down, but the ground nesting bees don't like mulch. So maybe have some areas without it.
Right, this is an interesting question here, kind of asking about if there's a reciprocal relationship between plants and pollinators. So aside from the function of pollination, are there other effects on, or are there effects on overall plant health from interaction with pollinators, like plant growth or blooming, or ability to reduce stressors or longevity?
Interesting questions. It looks like Paige and Kristen are leaving it to me again. Bees can impact the phenology of plants, and there's a recent paper that came out on that was really interesting, showing that bees can induce plants to flower quite a bit earlier than they would have by damaging the plants, and they can get these plants then to flower a couple of weeks earlier than they would have. Also, it's really well known that after a plant is pollinated, a flower is pollinated, that flower will die off much sooner, so the flowers will stay out longer if they're not getting pollinated, for more chance to be pollinated. So I'm not sure if that answered the full question, but yeah, there's lots of really interesting relationships there, not just the pure pollination one.
One thing I would just comment on quickly, and this is strictly observational, and maybe Laura, you could speak to it more, but is you see these periods of the day where there's more nectar production in plants, and then you'll see bees coming at those, what you might think of as peak periods. So camas is a great example of that. In the early evening, it seems like that you'll see a lot more bee activity, and I think that could be sort of a balance of ideal temperature periods. So I think it also has to do with the plant is providing, and probably co-evolved for those production periods.
Okay, and here's a question from Sharon. So we talked about how hedgerows and shrubby edges along rural roads can oops, sorry, now I got a frog in my throat. How hedgerows can provide habitat for pollinators, but they can also be home for lots of invasive species. We see that in our region. Our edges of rows often have lots of Scotch broom and Himalayan blackberry. So how do you suggest managing this dilemma?
I think that I see, Paige, you turned your mic off, so be sure to speak up in a sec. I just wanted to say quickly that I think that it's all just effort-based and priority-based and worldview-based, and that we're completely capable of converting back to native habitat. If we could so rigorously and with so much fervor convert our habitats to non-native, I think that we have as much energy if we wanted to go the other direction. And there are certainly, like Paige can speak to and has resources for, methods of removing invasive species And if there really was sort of a community drive for native plant production, like even on an industry level for restoration of large roadways and spaces, we could do it.
I agree, Kristen, and I hope I'm not too loud now, but I just wanted to emphasize that HAT has started an initiative called Hedgerows for Habitat, and one of the aspects is to work with farmers or any landowners who are keen to create that habitat using hedgerows. And we're going to have another webinar on that. But in terms of on the sides of roads, one of the aspects we saw from the pollinator stewardship workshop series we had done previously together, we did see response from municipalities and from the Ministry of Transportation on interest to do some of that work and to turn over some of the Scotch broom hedge roadways into habitat. And it was essentially a matter of capacity. They were trying to manage invasive species, and there was a lot of interest in seeing some of that conversion. So I think public pressure is a really powerful resource and community driven action. So you know, asking for that, demanding that from our local representatives, I think can really go a long way, and community effort as well. So I think it is a dilemma that we're working on, and yeah, I hope we can work together to find a good solution.
Okay, great. This is a question from a home gardener. So Kyla asked, if I clean up the garden in the spring, can I take down the hollow stem plants and leave them in the garden but broken off? Will they live through that? So the pollinators in the hollow stem, or when can I clean it up?
Laura, do you want to turn your mic on there? Because I was hoping you would pipe in with your canes that you have lying down right now and maybe comment on that. Basically, the answer is yes.
Yeah, that's about the answer. Yeah, you can clean them up and leave them there. You know, these overwintering bees, they're not that fragile, really. Like, you think of it, they're surviving the winter out there. So you can cut down those canes. You know, you might lose some, but I've done that with my Douglas Saster and goldenrod, and I just leave the canes behind the bushes of them. And yeah, I've seen some bees coming out. I had some tiny carpenter bees coming out, some Seratina coming out of that this year. And you know, you could just leave them back there year after year. They're going to go back into the soil, or if you want things a little bit cleaner, put it in a compost pile somewhere in your yard. But yeah, once they start decomposing, the bees aren't going to use them anymore. But yeah, that works well, and you don't have to leave everything standing.
And just a quick comment that, you know, all groups of organisms and all species within those groups have individualistic needs, and it's understandable that one garden maybe can't yield to all of those needs. And even just the inclusion of a few really pollinator friendly species, preferably native species, even if you decide to remove them at the end of the season or something, still do have more benefit than if they had never been put there at all. So just to encourage folks, even if some of the other aspects seem a little bit daunting right now.
So here's a question from Ariel. She's wondering, are the flowering cherry and plum trees that are so popular around the South Island beneficial for pollinators? And if not, do you have a recommendation for more compact flowering trees that are greater than 20 feet tall and 10 feet wide that can be used as a substitute?
I'll just comment on some of small tree alternatives, and maybe Laura can comment on the non-native cherries around. There is a native cherry species to the Victoria area that's really beautiful. So that is one option, bitter cherries. And some of the really sort of mid-range trees like black hawthorn, Pacific crabapple, tall Oregon grape isn't a tree, but it has like a taller kind of structure, woody structure to it, is super beneficial for pollinators. There's a tree called cascara, that's a mid-range tree. And there's also willow species that kind of like fuzz the lines on trees versus shrubs, but especially for butterflies, the willow species are extremely important. So James will talk about those in his webinar too. But I guess black hawthorn, like I mentioned, Pacific crabapple would be some of my top picks, and maybe Paige or Amy, you'd have more ideas for small trees, and then maybe Laura, you could comment on that first part to do with the pollinator friendliness of the cherries.
No, I think those are good choices for tree size plants. Certainly within the shrub category, there's a lot more of really nice flowering ones like mock orange, red flowering currant, but they don't get really big. So yeah, Pacific crabapple and black hawthorn, bitter cherry, good options. Red elderberry, actually, that gets reasonably large.
Yeah, and somebody commented on the chat there, Saskatoon berry too.
Oh,
I think that's a little smaller, but it's great. It's beautiful and good eating.
How could we forget?
How could we forget? Yeah, and in terms of the value of the non-native cherries and plums, I'm always out there looking. I don't think there's any research on this, but maybe the pollinator leadership team. We have a youth team that's out there looking at the natives and non-native plants and comparing the pollinators on them. We have Thompson on the call now, who's part of that group. But I do see some pollinators on there, but I don't see an awful lot. That's just my observations, not any solid data. I think the natives would probably provide more resources.
We still have quite a few questions, but it is now 2:30. So I just wanted to note that if people do have to leave the webinar, thank you very much for attending. If anybody wants to stick around a little bit longer, we can continue to answer a few of those questions. And you can always reach out to the panelists by email as well. There's so many questions, so many good questions. I guess before we close though, or even before most people have to head off, I wanted to pick the Moderator's Choice Award for good questions. And okay, this one I'm going to, because I haven't actually asked it out loud yet, I'm going to, if I can find it here. That was asked in the chat. So, is there a resource where we can find what plants are historically native to this specific area or ecoregion within the Pacific Northwest, i.e. the Lower Mainland? I think that's a good question.
Yeah, so should we answer that question? Is that the winning question, Amy?
Yeah, I like that question.
Oh, that's nice. Congratulations to that person.
Yeah, it's actually, I think, LR Best, which might be Lincoln Best. Yeah.
So, yes, there are some fabulous resources. So, for learning about the flora of the Pacific Northwest, I think that the Illustrated Flora of BC is a good resource, and that's kind of affiliated. That's part of the connection with eflora.bc.ca, which is the electronic BC Atlas for plants. And that would be a good place to start. And also Plants of Coastal BC by Jim Pojar and Andy McKinnon, sort of the red book that you're probably, many of you have, but it's a wonderful, wonderful field guide for flipping through plants. And then there are a number of keys that you know, taxonomic keys if you were getting like really into it, like other than the illustrated flora of BC, like plants of the Pacific Northwest, like the Cronquist and Hitchcock and stuff like that. But that'd be for really, you know, if you were really getting passionate, I guess. And Amy or Paige or Laura, do you have other ideas of resources that you like to use for learning about native plants?
I was just going to mention Saanich Ethnobotany by Nancy Turner, because that one is sort of a collection of information about which plants have been culturally important to the Saanich peoples. And so that's a good place to start for you know, ones that are considered indigenous to this area.
Yeah.
But yeah, let's see, I actually have it right here. Oops.
Oh, it's going psychedelic on us.
Yeah, weird. It doesn't recognize it as a person there. Maybe if I put it in front of my face.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
that's the Pojar and McKinnon Plants of Coastal BC. And then the other one Amy mentioned there was Saanich Ethnobotany by Nancy Turner and Richard Hepda.
Okay. All right, I'm just going to ask a couple more questions and then we'll wrap up. So this one, do bees change their food choices over time? So do they choose, for example, one flower one year and then the next year not like it anymore? I'm curious about that answer too. That was from Audrey Stibble.
I think that's definitely going to depend on the type of bees. So some bees are more generalist and they'll go after what's out there, and they'll be able to switch from year to year. So maybe one year is bad for one species of plant, but other ones have kind of taken over an area, and they'll be able to switch between the plants. So the majority of our native bees are on the spectrum of being more towards the generalist side. The ones that are more specialist along that spectrum, they're not going to be able to switch from year to year. You know, they want their certain species or group of species that they're going to need for pollen and nectar.
Okay. Now there is a couple of questions asked about acquiring larger pieces of land and securing them and recognizing them as habitat. So I think Alex K kind of asked a couple of questions about that. So how can we work with the City of Victoria or other jurisdictions to acquire larger pieces of land and secure them and recognize them as bee habitat?
That's an interesting question. I think it can be really challenging because land these days is very expensive in urban areas for purchase, and that's primarily because the value is based on the highest and best use of that land, which is typically development. So it's partly it's sort of a shift in our mindset of what makes a property valuable. But you could chat with land trusts in the area, and there are things like conservation covenants that the city can hold on different parks, and other nonprofits can hold, but also sort of long-term stewardship with volunteers of natural areas is really a meaningful way to recognize a space as an important ecological area for bees. Signage as well can make a difference. Do other folks have ideas on that?
Just one thought that came to my mind, and Laura might want to pipe in here too, but it's just through collaboration, like the Lochside Pollinator Meadow came to mind. So that's a parcel that we've worked with Pollinator Partnership and Peninsula Streams Society, and it's on BC Hydro land. So it's a large parcel along the Lochside Trail, and that came about, you know, through a number of factors, but it is an example of sort of like a larger parcel of land that you would think of as maybe something underutilized might be the word there, but through kind of a community initiative. And there's many examples of that. The meadow and wetland at Halliburton Farm are an example of that. But there are opportunities there. And it's just a matter of sort of you need a core group of people who are really passionate, who will kind of fight for something. That's many times what it comes down to, and there are opportunities out there.
There's also opportunities within the city of Victoria to for groups of community members to get together and work on a piece of public land, like to put forward a proposal and work on a piece of public land, for example, like to create a community garden or a pollinator meadow. It can be, they're encouraging people to do that on boulevards, but you can also put forward proposals for using other like public lands as well to do that. And there's a granting process called the Migrate Neighborhood Grant that groups of neighbors can apply to get funding to support initiatives like that. Okay, I'm going to ask one last question. There's still lots of good ones left, but we won't be able to get to all of them. I think this is a good question though. Kristen mentioned that there are several native species that hybridized and emphasized the importance of obtaining truly native seed. However, we also want to source seed from our particular region. Is it better sustainably to harvest seed from our particular area, like mid-Vancouver Island, or to purchase seed from a nursery, such as Saanich Native Plants, which will not be from our exact region?
That's a great question. So Amy, just to reiterate, the question is about seed provenance and provenance of plants in general, and about how kind of, is it better to collect ecoregional specific seeds and sort of risk harm to a native population of plants potentially, or kind of source them from a nursery, but they're not as genetically local? And I don't know if I have a quick answer to that really, because it depends on a number of factors, including the rarity of the species you're talking about. So maybe provenance may be more important for a rare species, and also where those nurseries are sourcing plants. So a lot of nurseries, will purchase something for resale, and those plants or seeds can be coming from quite far away. And then like associated with, or thinking about like collection of seeds, we have to be really careful about how we approach wild collection of anything, because you'll see statistics about, or not statistics, but sort of like like thinking about how much should you collect of something, and some people say 10% is fine, but we're talking about in some cases ecosystems that have already seen declines where in the case of Garry Oak ecosystems there's less than 5% less. So then how can we really give the license for saying, oh, go collect 10% of less than 5%? So I think being really, if you are doing any kind of wild collections, and I'm talking about for non-Indigenous communities, because there are community members who have absolute territorial rights for collection. So I'm speaking separately from that. But if you're out there collecting seeds and plants, to just be extremely mindful, because ask yourself some key questions like, do you really know what's growing here and how your activities might affect the population? And be honest with yourself about that. Can you really go into a natural area and identify most of the plants around you? Or are you just guessing at, a couple of the most common ones? And so you don't really know how your actions are impacting them. And I think different plants are affected differently. And it's a very complicated issue. So I guess I don't know the answer to the question.
But you could follow up too with the person that asked the question, if they want to have a conversation about that, a more in-depth conversation, I think that'd be great.
Yeah. In general, I guess I would say that going to a trusted nursery who has native plants of your area available, that is probably the best and most sustainable solution, particularly in home gardens. And asking, you can ask a nursery, what is the provenance of your plants? And nurseries, and good nurseries, will track that provenance. So if you talk to, you know, Nats and Langley and say, what is the provenance of that, they'll be able to tell you. And Saanich Native Plants will be able to tell you. And if they're unable to tell you, that's some of the red flags.
Okay. Well, we still have quite a few questions, but like I said, I've saved all the questions, so it's something that we can review and figure out a way, I guess, to get some answers to folks. That's all right with everybody, but in interest of everybody's time, I just wanted to yeah, close.
Well, thank you all, and thank you, Amy, for moderating that. That was wonderful, and Kristen for hosting this webinar and your awesome talk. And I think it's totally fine that we went over a bit because that was just some amazing information. So thank you all, and we'll see some of you on the next webinar.
Woohoo!
Thanks, everyone.